Prison populations are growing in Europe. To my understanding, they're growing in the Near East and Asia. Essentially everywhere that governments can afford to build prisons, they are. Why is this happening? I think really for two reasons, and again, it's the good news and the bad news. The bad news is that there's insecurity around the world. Governments everywhere have a hard time in the face of a global economy producing security for their citizens, and that creates enormous pressure. At the same time, for the good, governments all over the world are actually becoming more democratic. They may not have formal institutions of democracy that we would like to see developed, but because of global television and other features, they're becoming more responsive to popular pressures from their own streets. And that combination, inability to act on structural forms of economic insecurity or political insecurity, but demand by the people for some action for security, makes criminal justice a sort of very valuable territory for governments. And it's not surprising to see tough on crime campaigns following problematic elections and other kinds of political instability in many societies. I mean, keep in mind we're talking about very long-term trends here. Nobody in 1978 or 9 thought that the uptick of American prison populations by 2 or 3 percentage points a year was indicating any kind of dramatic sea change. In fact, for most of the 20th century, America's prison population fluctuated in gentle waves around 100 per 100,000 for about 75 years. Now we're at about 500 per 100,000, so we've gone up about 5-fold, even though crime really hasn't changed. So that's a tremendous change. Can we change back? I believe we are, but I think it's going to take a very long time, a similar sort of long wave of development. Why do I think this might be a good time? Well, if you step back and look at the period of history during which many people have called this the third great confinement, where America and many other countries have locked up more and more of their population, similar things happened actually in the 18th century, and even before that in the 16th century. That's why we call it the third confinement. But this one's much bigger. If you look at the period in which this has happened, which is basically the mid-70s till the middle of this decade, the 2000s, this is a period, first of all, of relatively good economic times in many parts of the world, so that governments have the resources to grow prison systems. But also, this was a time of relative less pressure or attention to the environment and environmental pressure. If you go back to the 1970s, it's the oil crisis. People are very concerned about energy. America is talking about small cars, better gas mileage. Jimmy Carter put on a sweater to, encourage people to turn up the heat and turn down the heat in their homes. We've gone through about 4 decades now where gas prices were very cheap. People weren't worried about energy or pollution. In a sense, they could focus more on stranger danger, and they could encourage their governments to spend a lot of money on prisons and building gated communities for people out in suburbs that are very hard to reach unless you have very cheap gas. So we're at the end of that now. Climate change is about to send all of us around the world back towards cities, toward living together in higher density, multi-use areas where we spend less energy trying to conduct our lives. If this is going to happen, it's actually going to require Americans to put some of their fear away. Because if we have so much fear, if we come back together into cities, these are going to look like high-tech prisons and not the kind of efficient, diverse, integrated cities that we think we need to have the kind of economy that we want in the 21st century. So there's no guarantee that these pressures alone will bring us less of a culture of control, less of a culture of fear. We have to seize that opportunity ourselves as citizens. I truly believe our leaders in a democracy don't truly lead on issues like this. They follow popular sentiments, and if we can demonstrate that we want more attention to the threats that now are posed from the environment, from hurricanes, from earthquakes and fires here in California, then I think we can get a new model of public safety in which the prison goes back to being a much more minor part of our social response to insecurity.
Let's talk about the state of California since we're here. California has the most prisoners in the United States, with something around 160,000 behind bars as we speak. Ironically enough, the state is also in a budget crisis. So how is this working out?
Well, the budget crisis is doing something very valuable for us, which is making visible to ordinary Californians the extraordinary price they pay to keep so many of their fellow citizens locked up. After all, to a fearful people, it might always seem like a good idea to keep more prisoners in prison for longer periods of time, even if it only makes you a little bit safer. Because why not be a little bit safer? But if suddenly we have to make real choices between whether we're going to keep prisoners, many of whom are now in 50 or 60 years old, and we're going to keep them in prison for many decades more, is that the right way to protect our children in the future, or do we need to reinvest that money in better infrastructure to protect our system. Our levee system, which surrounds Sacramento and many parts of the state, are very vulnerable, just like New Orleans before Hurricane Katrina. We need a lot more money to rebuild our school system, which has really deteriorated during these decades. And so these challenges, which I think Californians are aware of, can no longer be viewed as something we can have while at the same time locking up such a huge portion of our population. There's a trade-off to be made there. It's going to take some courage. What we've seen so far is that our legislators are very afraid to get at all ahead of the people on this. We just recently had a budget debate where there was proposals to let some prisoners, most of whom are invalids, they're older people who are often in wheelchairs or require lots of medical assistance. And the proposal was to move some of these prisoners into the community where they could be treated in hospitals at much less cost. And, you know, our legislators were afraid to do that. They thought that they would be blamed for letting dangerous criminals out on the street. And when you have that much fear, both by politicians and citizens, then it's very hard to do the rational thing.
And also, I know you talk a lot about race. Do you think that we will see perhaps not a shift in policy, but a cultural shift now that we have an African-American president in the White House?
I think so. I mean, one of the ironies of America's prison population and our prison system is that maybe for the first time in our history, our prison system is more racist than our society. That is, if you look at our society over time, our prisons are generally a reflection of our racism. And this is true all over the world. I mean, it's really staggering. If you are a young black man who has not finished high school in America, the chances are 2 out of 3 that you will end up in prison before you are 30. If you can stay in high school, by the way, you cut that in half. But the point is, that's a grotesque fact, and it fits our pattern of having huge disadvantages for people of color in America. But the good news, I suppose, is that for the first time in our history, our prison system may actually be more racist than our society. It no longer really reflects our social values. Rather, it reflects our fears, which tend to reproduce our past social values. And I think the election of Barack Obama signals the fact that Americans actually want a diverse, racially integrated, and open society. And when they look at prisons, they actually see the opposite of that. Many people don't know that right here in California, we have a prison system that's organized by race. I mean, you can walk up to the door of a California prison and see signs that say no black visitors today, because prisoners are actually locked down on the basis of race, depending on what's going on in the prison. And this is a secret, really, because if Californians really understood this, I think that they would begin to rebel against a system that is so far out of line with our basic core values today in America.
And something that some of us might not take into consideration is the extreme and a vast political clout that prisoner guards have at this point.
California may be distinctive in having perhaps the most powerful correctional officers union in the country, and it has made them perhaps the best paid public employees in the country. I tend to view correctional officers unions, businesses that produce construction for prisons and supplies as an important impediment to trying to shrink the system, but they're really not what drives the growth. It's in the end the fear that some of them are able to exploit. They see it day to day. They understand the toxicity that this is producing can be an important part of the solution, because a lot of what governments don't understand around the world is that when you put lots of people in prison, you begin to produce a kind of a toxicity in your culture that doesn't go away. And as you produce more and more people who have been through prison, you create a culture of mistrust because you don't trust your own citizens. I don't believe that prisons are death camps. They really are. They can be places of law. But if you have a population that you over-incarcerate and you don't allow exit from that system, over time you can create the conditions for true degradation of democracy and a loss of respect for human rights. And I think if we don't change, we're looking at that ahead in the next generation.
And let's wrap up on a global perspective. You talk about the global trend of imprisonment and security, but we also associate these trends with democracy. Isn't this ironic in a sense?
What a lot of people don't perhaps realize is that high levels of punishment and fear of crime can actually be associated with democracy. We sometimes associate them with dictatorship and authoritarian governments that do sometimes exploit fear of crime in order to justify repression. But they can also reflect democratic systems in which responsiveness to popular fears tends to drive politicians to often compete to who can be more extreme in projecting those fears and harsh responses to them.